Hello and welcome back. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. We're in book 2. And I'm looking today and thinking a little bit about just a little overview of some of the things going on in chapters 9, 10, and 11. Those 3 chapters relate to how the Old Testament and the New Testament fit together, how the Old Covenant and the New Covenant fit together. And so we want to give some thought about that. And honestly, there's lots in here, and I'm only going to give you just a few tidbits that stuck out to me. Chapter 10 spends a lot of time speaking about some of the ways that the Old Testament is similar to the New Testament. And one of the things that Calvin focuses on in this section is the way that Old Testament saints their hope was not mainly on earthly blessing, but on eternal blessing. And this is one of the things that some people miss when they read their Old Testament. They seem to think, well, maybe the land, maybe Canaan, maybe that land was the main thing that God had in mind for those people, and that's what all their hope was set on. And Calvin doesn't agree. He believes that, yes, they did have a promise that there would be some earthly blessing, and yet their ultimate reward was in heaven. And one of the places he goes to strongly on this is Hebrews chapter 11. He speaks about the fact that these people were looking for a homeland whose builder and architect is the Lord. They were looking for a heavenly city. And so Calvin is saying the Old Testament saints share something in common with the New Testament saints. We both share the idea that we both have an eternal reward. That is what God means for us to set our heart on. That's what we see the saints modeling, even in the scriptures. And so this is a way that we see some continuity, some similarities between the testaments. One of the things that he does in chapter 11 is he moves to seeing the ways that there are some differences. And again, I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but one of the main areas that categories he begins to speak in is the way of what we might call types and shadows, the ways that things appeared a particular way, but they were always pointing to something greater. And he actually sees the rewards as a type or a shadow. The promise of earthly rewards, he believes, is pointing forward to actually the eternal rewards. And so that's one way you might want to think about it. Another way, and this is perhaps a little bit more clear, is the way that we see the Old Testament sacrificial system and the work of the priest. We see that as a shadow pointing forward to the work that Jesus Christ, the great high priest, would ultimately fulfill. The high priest in the Old Testament, would present a particular sacrifice year after year. And yet in the New Testament, we see that Jesus is the fulfillment of that. He's the one who really does, who really does effectively bring forgiveness of sins. The blood of bulls and goats can never do that, but Jesus Christ can wash away sins by his blood. And so this is a way, again, of types and shadows that helps the Old Testament sets the stage for what Christ will fulfill. One of the last things that I'll just point out here is the way that he sees a difference between the Testaments, at least a little bit, is the way that God in the Old Testament did focus on a particular nation. He focused on a people that he had called to himself, and yet in the New Testament we see God's message and his call and his people are coming from all nations. And we know at the very end, of course, people will be saved from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so that's a way that we see a little bit of a difference of focus, a focus on Israel in the Old Testament and then all nations, not to exclude Israel, but all the nations, Israel and the Gentiles, will have part as are part of God's people. And so this is a way, again, that we see some differences. And I think these are ways that we can see, yes, there's a lot of similarities between the Old and New Testament. There are a few differences, and yet they're all part of one grand story. They all hang together. It's not 2 separate stories. It's all part of one grand plan that God has. And this is the way that Calvin helps us think about the way the 2 Testaments, the Old and the New Testament, fit together.